All right, so I have really good news this week, and that is that this is much easier than last week. As I always do, I bring props, but in this case, I only have one prop. Even though there's elements of moral arguments in other books, but Lewis's Mere Christianity kind of made it famous. The first third of the book, anyway, which was originally called The Case for Christianity. It was a popular, and popular meant something very different back then. It was a much more literate, popular audience. But still, it was a popular audience. During the height of World War II, on the BBC, Lewis gave this address, and it became the first third of this book. So Mere Christianity. If you've not read this, this is definitely one to read, at least that first part. But the moral argument is really starting in some ways like the other arguments do. It's starting from some common experience of something that we have in this world. Only difference is instead of cause or last week, truth or knowledge or consciousness that can go in different directions. Here it's the sense of right and wrong, a basic sense of right and wrong, and that's probably one of the reasons why it's the easiest of the arguments to grasp, because it's not only common like the other things are, but it's one of the first ones that your parents try to impress upon you, the difference between right and wrong. So what we'll do today is spend the majority of our time on Lewis's argument, and then, like last week, except a little bit longer here, the transcendental argument. There was a transcendental argument for God that presuppositionalists use when it comes to mind. Well, same thing about morality, the idea of there being moral oughtness, there being a right and a wrong. And what does that presuppose? Then, if I get to it, and I think I will, have to, we'll just brief evaluation of objections. They're actually easier to answer here, too. No coincidence, because the argument itself is easy. Now, here's the catch about how this starts. It can start in two different places, too, and not just because there's these two different forms, but even if you focus on Lewis, there's debates about whether Lewis was a classicalist or was he a proto-presuppositionalist, or at least in the sense that one or two of his arguments kind of go the same way, or was he more of a cumulative guy that would just start wherever? And that's probably more the truth, that he was more of a cumulative person that starts from all different angles. But even if you do that with his moral argument, there's the question of, okay, am I starting with a common experience of right and wrong? If you just read the first 2-3 pages of Lewis, you'll say, this is so clear and so obvious and so good, but then your mind might flash forward to our day where people are just raised by wolves, and you're like, actually, I can imagine all sorts of objections against the first premise here, because all kinds of people deny that there's anything like right and wrong. But actually, he's going to anticipate that. He's going to answer some objections. So the reality is that you can start even this argument in two different ways. You can assume that there's a moral sense that we all have in common and just get right into it, or you can establish that. And in a sense, Lewis does both. So without further ado, let's just get right into it. His argument for a moral lawgiver, and let me say it like this, a transcendent moral lawgiver from a moral law. And all this picture represents, at first, are a couple of everyday experiences or examples that he uses. You know, he just gets you to imagine. You hear people quarreling all the time. It could be all sorts of things. Somebody butts into somebody's seat on the train. Two children are saying, hey, no fair, I gave you a piece of mine, why don't you share yours? Or somebody saying to their parents, you promised, or something like that, and you're quarreling over something. And Lewis basically says, now notice that when this happens, the person that you're quarreling with that initiated whatever this wrong thing was, whether it's hitting you, as in this picture, the extreme, or whatever else, he never says, well, the way I would update this is say, he never says, like if a politician gets his hand caught in the cookie jar, or if somebody's caught plagiarizing, you know, nobody says to their professor, oh, no, I'm a nihilist. They don't do that. They make excuses. They deny it. So in other words, they either make excuses or they contend with the facts of the case. No, things are different in this case, and that's why I hit you, or that's why I took your seat, because whatever. They never say, well, there is no standard. Now, of course, this is what I meant before, is that Lewis might have to update that argument because there's people, all sorts of people, that do deny it. But again, he does deal with it with some of those objections. But here's his point to starting in this way. He says, it looks, in fact, very much as if both parties had in mind some kind of law or rule of fair play or decent behavior or morality or whatever you like to call it, about which they really agreed. And they have. If they had not, they might, of course, fight like animals, but they could not quarrel in the human sense of the word. Quarreling means trying to show that the other man is in the wrong. And there would be no sense in trying to do that unless you and he had some sort of agreement as to what right and wrong are. So this sense that Lewis is talking about, that we have in our common experience, is of something so objective that it's worth calling a law. And so that's what he starts to call it, a law of morality or decent behavior or whatever. And this law is something that all parties are making their appeals to, and they're expecting others to recognize. In other words, the disagreement is not whether or not there is a law, but simply on the facts of the case or something like that. But there's immediate objections to this. And I said, well, maybe Lewis will have to update his argument, but actually he already anticipates, in one form or another, all the objections that you're familiar with. And if you look in those first 2 chapters, 2.5 maybe, and you look carefully, you can extract all 5 of these arguments. So that's what I've done. I've made it easy for everybody to just bring them to the surface and list them. I have here, there's an argument, basically the person saying, now look, Lewis, isn't what you're calling the moral law nothing more than nature per se? In other words, something in nature, which I'll explain in a second. Or is it culturally constructed? Something that arises differently in each culture. Isn't this just our herd instinct? And these last 3 are going to be very evolutionary. In a sense, you could say that they're all evolutionary, but it's really going to come into play here. Isn't this just a herd instinct? With these right or wrong things to do goes against the instinct or is the instinct rising up in us? Or isn't it just what happens to pay me personally? Or, after all, we're not idiots. We realize that if you don't have this, you can't have a functioning society. And so isn't this just what's good for society? So one flavor or another, they're going to fit into one of these 5 categories. So let's talk about what these are really quickly. First, this first one, it might be thought that to speak of a law that's known by all in nature is nothing other than something else in nature. And it's what we mean by law. Just as there's a law of gravity governing actors with mass in space, so there's a law of harmony between human actions. But since we are humans, we sort of have a bias, and we notice that about us and think ourselves special. But Lewis says that what people used to mean by this law of nature was very different. Now, notice this difference he's about to draw out, because it'll show up in other places too. He says, a body could not choose whether it obeyed the law of gravitation or not, but a man could choose either to obey the law of human nature or to disobey it. So in other words, you never say to the rock, bad rock. It's a bad rock. You, right? And he actually draws that out with another example of a tree. Nobody says that tree is bad unless, in a manner of speaking, bad for shade, bad for wood, for the thing that I'm cutting it down for, or whatever. You don't mean that like a moral approbation or criticism. So, in other words, he's saying there's an equivocation going on here when we use the word law. The former, when you say law of nature, meaning the law of gravity, you're speaking about something that's descriptive. It's describing the way things happen to behave in nature. In fact, you're using the word nature differently too. Nature as in the physical surface of phenomenon that science studies. Whereas the latter, we're using this word prescriptively. That's our claim. You may not believe that at this point, but speaking to the atheist, but that's how we're using the word. We're using it differently. So the one merely describes, it tells us how things in fact do behave, whereas this law is claiming to tell us how we ought to behave, whether we do or not. So in other words, when we talk about morality, we're not doing the same sort of thing that the voiceover or the narrator is doing in a nature documentary when he talks about lions taking out a gazelle or something like that. He's just telling us, he's not making any judgment. But that's not what we're talking about here. Secondly, isn't this just culturally constructed? In fact, nations have different moralities. Different eras have different moralities. Across time and space, there are radically different moralities. So the conclusion is there's no such agreed upon set of principles. But Lewis, he argues this in greater detail in another book, The Abolition of Man, but he argues it in miniature here. And the argument is basically, no, that's actually not the case when you look closer. He says, I need only ask the reader to think what a totally different morality would mean. Think of a country where people were admired for running away in battle, or where a man felt proud of double-crossing all the people who had been kindest to him. You might just as well try to imagine a country where 2 and 2 made 5. Men have differed as regards what people you ought to be unselfish to, whether it was only your own family or your fellow countrymen or everyone. But they have always agreed that you ought not put yourself first. Selfishness has never been admired. Men have differed as to whether you should have 1 wife or 4, but they've always agreed that you must not simply have any woman you like. Let me stop right there. I can object to that very easily, and maybe in your mind you come up with something too. But what you're going to find about those objections, no one's ever been admired for selfishness. There are enclaves of, see right there, that's your answer. There are enclaves. Those are pockets of resistance, and those die out. Those can't envelope a culture as a whole without that culture dying. Another thing I would personally argue against Lewis is I would say, look, you've got to update this because you've not taken into account the end of societies. At the end of societies, Romans 1, what happens? Things get so bad that people totally do begin to celebrate the greatest extent. Now, even there, if you read Mere Christianity on, he'll have an explanation for that and why that's not an objection. I would agree with him, but I would just say we got to anticipate that objection because it's not hard to come up with. So in the main, his argument here is no. Different civilizations have not had totally different moralities in the sense that everything, all the way down to the root, we think opposite about. No, at the root and in the essence and the principle level, all mankind has, and the Bible does teach that, Romans 2:14 and 15, about the moral law among the pagans, what the Christian tradition is called the natural law. Okay, and that's what Lewis is going there. And if you want, read The Abolition of Man, and he'll get into that more specifically. Third, can't this law of right behavior be our instincts? And those are developed over evolutionary time. The herd instinct. So we act unselfishly because we have to. We have to have a network, the weak people getting together to stave off the strong man, and you have civilization arising out of that, and so on. And Lewis says no, because you'll notice that there are none of our impulses, or in other words, our instinctual level, none of our impulses which the moral law may not sometimes tell us to suppress, and none which it may sometimes or not sometimes tell us to encourage. And there's all sorts of examples you can use, and they're especially, just think of the one I just brought up. Lewis doesn't bring this up, but on a more sophisticated level, he'll use simple ones. That objection that unselfishness arises evolutionarily by the need to cooperate and so on. But shady oligarchies cooperate too. Conspirators cooperate. Military generals cooperate. Demons cooperate with each other. People that have done you harm in the past have cooperated to stab you in the back. Cooperation by itself, that's not going to work, even if it happens to work for that little network of people. Okay, so even on a sophisticated level, that won't work. But Lewis does you a favor. He uses really easy examples, but he does something else that's genius. And I'm going to use this analogy. I wish he would have expanded on this analogy. He uses the analogy of a piano player, a keyboard, the keys, and a sheet of music. And basically what he does is he compares this moral standard to a sheet of music and our instincts to keys on the piano. And in this light, there's not one right note and another wrong note. And you'll notice you look at a piano and you'll never see any of the keys that say X or that say, yeah, hit me every time. No, they're the right note at one point and the wrong note at another, but based on what? So is that moral relativism? No. They're the right note and the wrong note in accordance with the sheet of music, the notes that have been composed. And so he compares that to the motions of the soul that have to answer the right way to the law. Remember that the sheet of music there is the law with its commands. This has enormous explanatory power for all sorts of things. For example, it explains why many instincts can be obviously right in some cases, like a mother's love, and these are examples that he uses. A mother's love, patriotism, and the sexual instinct. They can go terribly wrong in other cases. So, okay, I understand that your violent impulses and those impulses, but a mother's love, when can that go wrong? Well, it can go wrong in a school shooting this week. It can go wrong in all other things that maybe you just need to think about a little bit more. Favoritism is obviously one thing that would come to mind. So people might disagree on where those lines are, but you'll notice that moral relativists are using this very point to suggest, you see, there's not one way to say that these things are always right or wrong, but if you dig more under that surface, that actually, even the relativist argument bears kind of a reluctant witness that these instincts are not the ultimate source of rightness. There's none of our instincts that are the instinct, and the other ones are always wrong. Fourth, it's argued that morality is a matter of convenience. So to say such and such is wrong for somebody else, we hear this all the time. You do you. That's right for you, but not for me. Well, if that works for you, then that's your morality, and so on. So it's no different to say the tree is bad or no good when you're talking about the shade, that example I brought up before. It's what happens to benefit me personally. It's individual utility. Well, Lewis here brings the reader back to his opening example of quarreling, and specifically the guy that shoves in, or does he, to the seat on the train. You're not even sure, your back is turned. And so he says, a man occupying the corner seat in a train because he got there first, and a man who slipped into it while my back was turned and removed my bag are both equally inconvenient. But I blame the second man, and I do not blame the first. Sometimes the behavior which I call bad is not inconvenient to me at all, but the very opposite. In war, each side may find a traitor on the other side very useful. But though they use him and pay him, they regard him as human vermin. And he uses other examples as well. So convenience, in any particular case, doesn't really hit at what we're talking about either. And then finally, social utility. You say, okay, fine. It's not convenient for you personally, but isn't this what we need for society? Now, of course, nobody denies that right behavior makes for a better society than wrong behavior does, if you care about society. The problem is, at the end of a culture and the end of a civilization, you have an increasing amount of people that want to tear it all down. So it makes it more difficult to make this argument. But for the person that does make the argument and says, well, that's enough to explain morality, there's something circular going on here. And Lewis says it like this. If we ask, why ought I to be unselfish? And you reply, because it is good for society. We may then ask, why should I care what's good for society? Except when it happens to pay me personally. And then you will have to say, because you ought to be unselfish, which simply brings us back to where we started. You're saying what is true, but you're not getting any further. So these objections had to be answered in order to solidify his first few premises. And so what are those? Just to review. What he said so far is that there is a rule, there is an inner sense of right and wrong in all human beings, which no human beings made, and in fact, he even makes the point, and which we don't live up to. So another argument you can make is sort of he doesn't have this in here, but the deconstructionist argument, which could sound a lot like, well, it's socially constructed. But here, someone like the Marxist is not going to go in the same direction as a Freudian or somebody else. A Marxist or a Nietzschean on the other side is going to say, this is the invention of the powerful class and whatever else. Lewis does address this, and all sorts of Christian apologists have addressed this in the last 100 years, and they've addressed it in different ways. And one of them is to simply show the record of history, how that doesn't really work out, and how collectivists and modern ideologues are always the one that are suppressing Christianity. And why is that? It's because it's cutting in on their business. It's actually not good for business if you're the powerful class. In other words, you're showing that Christianity, and specifically Christian morality, is not the sort of thing you would invent if you want to dominate other people. But you do have to be ready for that objection as well. So where does he move from here? I said this is a genius metaphor, and I wish he would have expanded on it, actually, because I think it would have made his point in terms of his next premise. And just get to it. His next premise, where he wants to go next, is to say that this, and he says it like this, is this cause, this explanation, what lies behind the law, is more like a mind than anything else. Okay? Where'd you get that? And I would say that for most people, you kind of have to read this section 3 or 4 times to, and I don't believe it's because you can't show it clearly. The way he goes, I think, is good. I think it's affected positively a lot of people as they've read it. Honestly, I think there's other things you could have added to make it clear, and I think expanding on this metaphor could have done that. Okay, so given the very nature of man, that we can count for morality precisely because of the nature of what it is inside of it. It's not like one of those rocks. It's not like one of those trees. It's not even like the anthill that you can make analogies to society working together. There's something else going on inside of us, but you say, oh yeah, inside of us. Oh, that's so subjective. I remember the first time I ever commended this argument to somebody, and that's what they heard. Oh, something inside of me. Oh, squishy Disney time. Like, no, that's you're reading that wrong. He's not talking about its subjectivity. He's making an appeal to something that we all have experience of, and now he's not leaving it at that. He's asking us all to now look at what that is, and in a sense, he has to point to something that is outside of us. And that's the only tough part of this argument. Okay, so this is why materialism, now think of materialism, and I'll show you this in my next slide, but now think of materialism as the ivory. What are these made out of? I don't know. They're made out of ivory, or if you have a cheesy keyboard, they're made out of plastic. But the point is, they're matter. They're physical. So the materialist in this analogy is saying, the stuff that this is made of is all that exists. And in fact, it's convenient that you're the same color as the keyboard there, because that's all you are. You're made of the same stuff. So have that in your mind about the materialist worldview. And so the materialist may hear, it's like, okay, so you're saying, well, how do those noises emerge from that? Well, that's easy. The sound waves, like, actually, no, Mr. Materialist. We're saying more than that. We're not saying what explains the sound. You might say, what explains the difference between the beauty of the sound versus perhaps the ugliness if we don't know how to play it? Maybe think it like that. Or picking the keyboard up and hitting our sister with it. What explains the difference between that and that? Well, something like that internal and immaterial structure of man is going to be a cause that is sufficient for this. And any other cause, a material cause, the things that just lie on the surface, is going to be an insufficient cause for this. And the reason he's making these comparisons he's about to make is he has to answer this question. Why does this have to be a thinking, choosing, moral actor who is the cause of what's telling me to think and act in a certain way? So in order to clear this ground, he makes a couple more contrasts. There's a chapter called Rival Conceptions of God. And before he even does that, he has to continue to do some groundwork here. And I just I just made it easy with that analogy. Really what he's saying is that the materialist has to account for the difference between the notes and why there's a symphony emerging by the stuff itself. And that won't work. And furthermore, if materialism is true, no key is any different than another. So yes, they are. They make a different sound, but all you're doing there is sound waves. How does something intangible or above and beyond that emerge that it makes a difference between a beautiful harmony versus not? Okay? So the first comparison is the materialist versus the religious explanation. So while the objections of materialism, I think he answered him in those objections, he has to go further. He has to ask how we know most about this law. So here's where he actually goes instead of extending this analogy. He makes another analogy to a sender of mail and all of us receiving that mail. And it's kind of an odd analogy in a sense. He says, there's one thing in the universe, and one thing only, which we know more about than we could learn from external observation. And that one thing is man. We do not merely observe men, we are men. And that's kind of what's odd about the analogy he does use. He pictures us opening up the mailbox when we want to look, where would I find evidence of what this is actually like? Well, I'm going to open up this letter, and I find out that as I look over to your mailbox and that you're opening the same sort of letter I am. Even there, he doesn't go further. And all I want to say is it was a pop-level thing on the BBC, and so maybe he would have gone further. I think this analogy, if he had played that up, it would have been even better. But you can kind of see where he's going. And he makes one more little mini analogy to a house and the builder of a house. And he imagines us as not just the inhabitants of a house, but also in a sense, because you got to mix metaphors here, we're part of the house. It's kind of odd. Imagine somebody building a house, and you are both an inhabitant of the house, you find yourself inside of it, but you're also part of it. You're not like the lamp or other things that can't talk, so just picture yourself as part of it. What's that movie, the Disney movie, Beauty and the Beast, where the candles and all that, they start to talk and sing. So go there. I'm helping Lewis out here, give him the Disney version. So picture yourself as part of that house that is both part of it, but at the same time, you can start to talk and know things. And why are we doing this? Well, the question is, where am I? How do I find out about the cause of this house? So it's like that. We can discover the architect, and we can't do that by making him out to be just another one of the pieces of the house. Well, the materialist says, that's fine. I don't believe in an architect. But Lewis's point still stands because he is left to say that the sender of the messages or the composer of the song is one of these pieces of ivory. Well, that doesn't make any sense. And the sender of that message to your mailbox is actually just one of the other candles, or maybe wood itself, all of the wood, or something like that. Well, that doesn't make any sense. That's not a sufficient explanation. Okay? So it would be clearer if the sender of the message was trying to influence our behavior. And that's kind of where he does go. He has to show that the attributes of this law or rule is that they show that they are the product of personal preference. Because the whole point here is to show that the cause is more like a mind than anything else, given its preference of good over evil, and in such a way that there's a pattern. You can see why good things are good and why evil things are evil. You can see the relationship, okay? And so then he begins to compare, I'll just leave this one on. Then he begins to compare the rival conceptions of God. So you're going to look at pantheism first and then dualism. And I've done some of the heavy lifting there because in week 4, we talked about the different isms. So you're already hopefully familiar. I'll just recap. Pantheism is the belief that all is God. So pan, all, theos, all is God. So there's no distinction there. Whereas dualism is the belief in two, and this kind of dualism is equal and opposite dualisms. Dualism. So you have two ultimate powers. But there's a problem that emerges with both, and I'll explain it on the piano again. With pantheism, there's no distinction between one note and another. So, for example, is killing bad? Well, a surgeon kills a cancer. And that's a typical example that you use when you're comparing Eastern religions like Buddhism or Hinduism and Western views. Okay, You can't make a distinction that stands apart from the whole system because everything is God. And any kind of distinction like that outside of the system is an illusion. So he makes quick work of that. And Lewis says, look, if there is a close second, if there is another view that is somewhat respectable, it will be dualism. But that won't work either. And then he tells you why. And, well, let me just put it on the board here, and that's why I did. If you've got these two ultimate beings, there's really no way, and some of this is review from week 4, how do I know which one's good and which one's bad? Except that I happen to prefer one or the other. And if you say, no, one's really good and the other's really bad, well, then you have to ask, by what standard? There would be some standard that by which you know that the good one is good and the bad one is good. But then that standard would be a third thing over and above both of them. And then that third thing would be the ultimate being, because it would be exerting even a causal influence over this being that you're calling the good being. And so that's essentially Lewis's argument against dualism, which we kind of talked about in week 4. So he dispenses with that. And here's where things stand. Here's my summary of Lewis's argument in this whole section. Premise 1, there is a law of right and wrong in all mankind. And again, most people are going to agree with that. By the way, good news. When you run into somebody that doesn't want to agree with that, they know where it's going, or they just want to be belligerent. Whatever it is, they are at the point where they say, fine, genocide is morally permissible. Fine, doing such and such to babies, no argument, can't judge. You'll run into people like that. Good news on that. That's not going to impress the onlookers. Because your onlookers now are the normal people that you're going to appeal to. And this person has now stepped outside the bonds of humanity, has made himself a moral monster. I'll take it. So if he doesn't want to accept my first premise, then I'm going to continue to play that up. Because the vast majority of people are going to accept that there actually is a right and wrong. Okay? And we've seen what Lewis did with all the objections. It could be this, it could really be this, it could be subjective. He said, no, if you believe in an objective morality, that something really is right over all people, that's what we mean by there being an objective right and wrong that stands over all. Premise 2, this law cannot be reduced to any part of nature, much less can its cause. Third, this cause must be more like a mind than a non-mind, given preference or that pattern of preference of right over wrong. Fourth, this law must come from a singular, this is because dualism is false, therefore the fourth premise, this law must come from a singular ultimate good or ultimate right. And if all that's true, then just put your premises together. This cause must be a singular mind at one with ultimate good and right. At one, in other words, he's not reaching outside of himself for some second thing. He is what is good and right. So, and again, you say, well, Lewis didn't follow through, or he didn't, or maybe he should have used that piano metaphor. And again, I would say this was an address to a popular audience, and I think if he was making an academic paper out of it, he would have drawn that out more. But that's in essence what he's saying. Okay, really quickly, the transcendental argument. We did this with mind. We can draw it out a little bit more starting with morality. And again, what is the transcendental argument? Where does that come from? If you see TAG, that's what it's abbreviating, the transcendental argument for God's existence. This is the Van Tillian sort of replacement for natural theology, because that was wrong for X, Y, Z reason. And so they offered us this kind of an argument. Well, the idea is that this is how we're going to show the atheist that you must presuppose God in order for X, Y, and Z to be the case. Last week we saw that logic was the X, Y, or Z. You all need logic. Well, what is the precondition for that? Well, it's God. Well, that's true. I agree with that, but I showed you how you actually are assuming logic there, not God. You're concluding for the necessity of God. But remember, presuppositionalists, they've pinned themselves into the corner of insisting that you must start with God. He can never be a conclusion. He has to be what your argument starts with. And that as I said in week 2, when we talked about method, confuses the order of being with the order of knowing. And the same thing is true about their moral tag argument. This is representing with the foundation being God and then building on that objective morality. We absolutely agree that God must be in order for there to be good. And we'll see more of why that is when we talk about the problem of evil in a few weeks. Completely true. This must be for that to be. What are we talking about? Being. That's the order of being. If I'm speaking to you and you're pretending to not believe in God, and I'll use the word pretending, because there I want to have common ground with my presuppositionalist brother again, and say, yep, we're Calvinists. We believe in Romans 1. They are suppressing that truth, but we're digging it out of them. Both approaches are. When you do that, and you start, in this case, with some moral sense, what are you doing? Well, let's see the argument. And I think John Frame puts this well. He's clear about the argument in his book, Apologetics to the Glory of God. There's a new name for it in the last 10 years. They reprint. I think it's just called Apologetics. But anyway, Frame says, so, as a matter of fact, we all, believer and unbeliever, act and think as if these values, these moral values, are objective, rather than merely subjective. Now let's stop right there. What's Frame doing? Same thing Lewis did. He's just making it short and sweet. Lewis used all these examples and so on. Frame is basically making a couple statements and then saying, okay, what this means is that when we talk about right and wrong, for example, when you criticize our Bible because you say God is a moral monster and so on, you're saying that God is actually wrong, that he's actually failed to conform to some standard, which is not just my personal preference, but something that actually is a standard outside of all moral actors. When you do that, you are agreeing with us at least that there is some obligation to something outside of us all that doesn't change. Again, what's Frame doing? Same thing Lewis did. He's starting with morality, with there being moral obligation, and he's saying to the atheist, you already know this. You already believe this. Now, where does he go next? Well, Frame moves from there to say, now, where does the authority of the absolute moral principle come from? Notice that I am not asking where the conviction itself comes from, as if this were a causal argument. In other words, he's saying, I'm not saying, if we could blow one of these guys up and you can see in their heart, I'm not asking you to consider where that feeling inside me arose. I'm not making a causal argument. The question concerns the authority of that principle. Now, if I'm an atheist, I'm going to say, you just leapt from an obligation to, what is this word, absolute? Why are you doing that? Well, Frame's about to show you, and I agree with this idea in the transcendental argument. Because if there is any obligation at all, we've already agreed that that obligation has to be outside of us or it could not oblige us. If it is not authored outside of us, it can't be an authority that commands us. So Frame is asking, what are the necessary conditions for there to be such an authority? It can't simply be relative. It can't be this infinite, now I'm adding language to him, but it can't just be this shell game with an infinite amount of cups, and you say, well, it's out there, but then you're just shuffling around parts of nature or parts of society or whatever. It has to be absolute if it actually stands over all moral actors at all times. So to get right to the point, absolute moral obligation is said to demand two things: ultimate authority and personality. Why personality? This he does not argue like Lewis does. Lewis does the music sheet and so on and so forth, those attributes that rise above material. Frame focuses on personal dimension. If you canvass all the examples that you can possibly think of personal obligation, after all, we're talking about persons, not members of the animal kingdom or anything like that. If you look at all those examples, we're never finally obligated to a material object or even to a principle considered in the abstract. These are only the mediums of moral exchange. Think about it. If someone owes a debt, not even to just a person right in front of them, but even when we owe a debt to a man who dies, the necessity to pay it to his offspring is still rooted in his personhood and their personhood and the relationship between their persons and his person. Atheistic philosopher Richard Taylor recognized this, and yet he denied such a person, and therefore went all the way denying objective moral obligations. This is what you'll see in the more consistent atheists, Richard Dawkins, with the selfish gene. They know it, they see it, and they want to be, for them it's more important to be a consistent atheist than it is to rescue morality. So they say, well, then there is no free moral action, or there is no morally significant action, or there is no, and they'll go there. But as we're seeing from Dawkins right now, as the barbarians are at the gate in England, and they're not at the gate, they're in the gate now, Dawkins is changing his tune. Because you have to. Because one of the attributes of a worldview, you might remember, was not that just that it's logically consistent and empirically tested. The third attribute of a worldview, it has to be what we call existentially livable. Livable. I would ask the atheist, why do you keep showing up to debates if nothing matters? Why do you keep doing that? What difference would it make if Christians won this debate? If this is just a religious gene and maybe it's supposed to evolve into something else and so on, why do you keep showing up? And Dawkins is changing his tune. But what Frame is saying is that what this shows is that this presupposes an absolute person. Not only must it be absolute, it must be a person for it to oblige other persons. I agree with that completely. I will say, though, as a pushback against my presuppositionalist brothers, that in this case, this absolute person has been concluded. He's not been presupposed. And there's nothing wrong with that. But just recognize it. When you do that, you're still borrowing and using all the language that you're using from traditional natural theology. You're taking things in this world that you're appealing to your audience to say, you know that thing, obligation, you know that thing, morality, that you would agree with me is not just a feeling we have, we're actually obliged to something else. When you do that, you're starting from those common notions of things in this world, and you're arguing to God, not arguing from God back to God, which would be a circular argument in logic. Okay? So, how does this look formally? Well, I compared Frame's to Anderson's, and James Anderson teaches at RTS Charlotte, but he'll teach online as well. And so in Orlando, he actually came and did the apologetics class, and I took that class. And so from his notes that he offered, I copied and pasted that. That's Anderson's version, and it follows Frame very closely. But what he does is he just kind of unpacks that. So my point to putting these back to back is just to give you a simpler version. And then if you're thinking of objections, well, that's part of what Anderson's doing, is he's heading those off of the past. Frame is basically saying objective morality exists. Secondly, objective morality implies an authority that is sufficient to bind all moral agents under its law. Thirdly, objective obligation implies a person to whom one is finally bound. Therefore, the only possible source of moral obligation is an absolute person or God. So Anderson just does, all he's doing is unpacking the same thing. To take out wiggle room, that first premise, for example, human moral judgments presuppose absolute norms of morality. Because the atheist is thinking, why not relative? Just barely outside of me in society. That's what I owe myself to. Why does it have to be ultimate or absolute? So that's what he's doing, though. So I offer that for your benefit, not to say that the two arguments are opposed to each other. One's just unpacking the other. So, and this is an example, I just want to make this clear again, how a classical view can embrace elements of presuppositionalism. And a presuppositionalist, we would say, is really just, when they're actually arguing, they are borrowing from the standard way that you have to. It's just the way the world works. That's what's meant by the classical view. It's just that's what it is. It's the stuff reality is made of. So newer things that have tried to emerge to do it differently, that's something to keep in mind. but that doesn't mean we're against them. Those are good tools and good contributions they make. I just taught, so Aiden's first fallacy that he learned in the book, The Fallacy Detective. And if you're a homeschooler out there, The Fallacy Detective is a well-read book. Everybody reads it. You have to. It's got a little dog on the cover and all that stuff, and it teaches, each chapter has a new fallacy, and the very first one is the red herring fallacy. And the red herring fallacy is part of a larger category called avoiding the question. And these are what we call informal fallacies. They're the stuff you hear all the time in everyday conversation. And avoiding the question is just what it says. You've got a debate, and somebody, maybe not intentionally, maybe not maliciously, they just go off in a different direction. And this fallacy was so named because hunters wanted to train their dogs to really track down that whatever it is they were hunting, raccoon or whatever else. And so to train them, they would take these stinky, smelly fish and throw them down the trail, and they would eventually, I don't know how they would do it, but this is the story, train them to stop following that and stick with the actual scent here. And, I remember one time in 1996, I was 20 years old, just getting into politics, and I turn on TV, there's the debate between Bob Dole and Bill Clinton, and I don't even remember what Dole was saying, criticizing Clinton's record of whatever else he was saying. And after about 5 minutes of Dole being completely boring, but getting to the point, Clinton then turns to the cameras, and I kid you not, no attack ever fed a hungry child. And I'm 20-year-old brain, I'm thinking to myself, I'm looking around the room, but I know enough to know that most people are like, that's a good point. Dole is mean, and this guy's nice, and he knows my feelings. And I'm like, what's that got to do with anything? What does that have to do with it? And now I'm being mean because I'm raising my voice. And that's the kind of thing you do. Now, we call it something else in everyday conversation, a rabbit trail. Ever been trying to lead a small group, and then somebody goes Nephilim on you? You're like... You're talking about nothing wrong with the Nephilim. I'll talk about them next week in the sermon. But I'm trying to talk about the active obedience of Christ, or something about the atonement, or Paul's use of the word namas or whatever, and Nephilim. And you're like, what? Why are we doing this? That's what we call that a rabbit trail. Well, it happens with very sophisticated people. It happens with people that write books, that get their books published. And Douglas Groothuis, in his a book on apologetics, he looks at two kind of stock arguments that atheists bring out at this point, and what he wants to show is that don't get distracted by this. This is not addressing the question of there being an objective morality. Now, what do they say? And they're trying to say, well, why do the norms have to be personal? Why do these norms have to be absolute? Why do they have to be transcendent to matter? Or why does it have to be a mind? So here's what they'll do. The first one he takes from an atheist named Paul Kurtz. So these are books written pretty recently. And he makes this argument that God is not necessary for morality because atheists can and have acted in concert with universally shared moral principles. Now, this is the kind of thing that the new atheists had to try to do, at least Christopher Hitchens. Guys like Dawkins, he didn't care. Harris, sometimes he cares, sometimes he doesn't. But he wants to reduce it all to brain activity and so on. But this is the standard way to do it. No, an atheist can be, because he could be a moral person. And we talk about, here I am talking about moral principles, and I'm using some of the same words you are and so forth, and that kind of gets to the second argument, is now it just turns from theism to Christianity, if you've ever heard this version, is that no, people that don't have any religion, they can be moral people. They can use the same terminology, good, right. We can even say it is objectively right. It is a right that is outside of all of us, that we expect everybody. We together are obliging. We, the people, are deciding what morality is. That's what he's really saying by objective, which is not the same thing. But what are they really trying to do? They're trying to short-circuit the whole question of, is this a sufficient explanation for what morality is? And they're bringing you to this whole, hey, look at me. Hey, look, atheists. Isn't it true that atheists in your own experience, you know people that are not Christian, they don't go to your church, but they're a really nice person, they do good things. What are they doing? They're throwing red herrings down the trail. And if we're not careful, we follow it, because it seems like they're talking about the same thing. It seems like they're directly They're not. They're not addressing the root of the question, which is, what are the sufficient necessary conditions for the kind of thing that an absolute moral obligation over all human actors at all times, what does that have to be? So that's why this is a red herring. I have other things about, improving. This might be, real quickly, I'll just address it. That might be shifted on your printed version, so if you can look at that. But if it looks like that, great, it worked out. But it shifted on me in the morning. It did it? It did it around 3? Okay, if it did it, good. I had to change that today because it ran off the screen. I was like, oh. But anyway, again, as I said before, I kind of already built this into my argument, is I would strengthen Lewis's case by Lewis's own metaphor. I would wish that Lewis would have used the piano and the sheet of music metaphor more to establish why this must be a mind. If he did that, though, it would bleed into next week, the last one called the teleological argument. After all, a composer of music has a certain end. He doesn't just randomly compose music and it shows up a certain way. He wants to produce a symphony. Just like the architect, the builder of the house wants to create a home, not just a scrap of lumber or whatever. So there's a certain design there. If I start getting more and more into what right and wrong must be as a product of mind, I'm going to get there by asking questions like, well, right or wrong for what? Good for what? So you say, well, this is just like the tree being just good for shade. I'm saying no. When we say that this is really right outside of all of us, we are saying things like, this is right for marriage to be what it is. You say, well, that's just pragmatic too. No. Keep moving up that chain. Well, what's marriage? Or this is right, or this is good so that we don't kill each other. Okay, that's just a pragmatic argument too. No, why is it wrong to kill each other? And then you get into the image of God and so forth. So if Lewis went there, he would have to drive this to being sort of a hybrid moral/design argument. And it's probably a good time as any to point out that that's another objection that atheists have brought up against natural theology. Anthony Flew, whose name I might have mentioned before, was a 20th century British atheist. By about 2004 or 5, a couple years before he died, he shifted to being a theist. Didn't become a Christian, as far as we know, but became a theist because of the design argument and other things. But one of the things he said in his atheist days was that these arguments, sure, they're valid. They show one attribute of something. But he brought up an objection that's become called the leaky bucket objection. And he said that all of these just kind of depend on each other. So now picture these buckets that all have a leak in them. And they're springing, they're gushing out. Because you bring up objections against them. And in order for the Christian apologist to fill that water back up, he has to borrow from one of the others. So picture now the buckets functioning like a shell game, except now, and there's 5 of them, and they're rotating around. And he's saying that they only work if you borrow from one or two of the others. My response to Flew has always been, so an argument is more defective if it shows up in more of reality? I see another case of intellectual laziness. And this is actually one of my problems with arguments that are too short. It's nice to make things on the bottom shelf and make it helpful for people. That's a good intro, but we also have to point out to people, especially to atheists when they bring it up, is to say, look, that's just an intro book. Give it a second, wait for it. There's actually more steps to this argument. And to me, that's not a defect in any of these arguments, that it brings in causal elements or design elements and so on. There's another argument I would just say, I'll give anybody the notes if they're interested. There's another problem with the presuppositionalist transcendental argument, and it shows up in their misunderstanding of natural law, which mirrors their misunderstanding of natural theology. Is something called the naturalistic fallacy, which if anybody's interested, I'll answer afterwards, or I'll write something eventually on it. But let me open it